Hello, everybody. It's been 3 weeks, I believe, since I've done anything, and been quite a long time. And well, I was on vacation for a couple weeks, and then I also was had some kind of a respiratory virus that really brought me down. I was sick for 2 weeks. So the first part of my first week of my vacation, I was sick. So I'm just now starting to get to where I feel like I'm getting most of my strength back. But anyway, it's good to be back. I'll continue talking about the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. This is the third edition. I've had people ask me if they needed to get the book. I'd encourage you to get the book, obviously. I think it's a great read. There's a lot of good information in there. It will be very helpful for you to have access to. I'll be talking about the book, so I mean, if you didn't want to buy it, you could listen to what I have to say. You'd have to take a lot of notes probably, but either way, I do think, personally, I think it'd probably be better to buy the book. It can be bought pretty cheap on Amazon. Buy a used book. You could probably get this book for $5 or $6, and it's well worth that for sure. So, but anyway, I want to talk about chapter. I think it's chapter 13 today. The chapter on Revelation, chapter 13, and I'm not following the ordering of the book as it's presented. I did do a couple chapters initially from the beginning. I think I had you read a couple chapters too on your own. But the reason why I jumped to Revelation is because I'm getting ready to preach through the book of Revelation, so I thought it'd be good for people to hear some of this information before we get started on the preaching. Won't be able to talk about a lot of this stuff during the preaching, so it's a way for me to introduce important elements about Revelation for people to know so they can have a better understanding of what's going on within the book of Revelation itself. Now, let me talk about communication real quick. One of the things about Revelation that people don't understand is, obviously how to incorporate the information. But a lot of people will say something to the effect of, I read the Bible literally, as opposed to, I guess, not literally, whatever other symbolically, I guess, or something to that effect. I don't know. Really, I mean, I really don't even understand that statement if you think about it. It's kind of it's not really saying anything. As far as understanding what's being communicated, you want to be able to understand what the author is communicating to a specific audience at a specific point in history at a specific location. For the most part, that's what you want to understand. And so you're wanting to know what the author is communicating. Now, from that, you can derive some principles possibly that could be effective for and beneficial for your own life. So we want to understand what the author is communicating, and we want to understand how the author is communicating. So we have lots of different types of writings in the Bible. In fact, this book is going to talk about several of those types of genres, literary types in the Bible itself. There are many, many more. But understand that you have to read a text according to its means of communicating. So let me give you a little example here about communicating that you probably never thought of, but you'll understand real quickly when I bring it up. Think about our tradition of Thanksgiving dinner. We always have a turkey. And maybe somewhere along the line you've encountered, or you heard something, maybe on a movie, or maybe even in your own life, you've heard someone say in a setting, Thanksgiving setting, or some other kind, maybe Christmas setting, where you're going to serve turkey. Maybe someone would say, "Did you dress the turkey?" or "Will you dress the turkey?" or something to that effect. Or they may say, "I have to go dress the turkey." Well, we know what that person is saying. They're saying they're going to have to go prepare the turkey for cooking, and maybe if it was a hunting catch, a hunting kill, then you'd have to defeather it and remove other parts, or there are other things. Maybe it's brining the turkey meat, maybe putting spices on it, so forth and so on. You're getting that bird ready for some kind of a cooking, when you say dress the turkey. Now, imagine someone that's not from our culture. Let's say somebody from the Philippines, and they heard you say that. What would they think? Would they think what about preparing, or would they possibly think, why would you want to put a shirt on a turkey? Maybe that's the way they think about it. It probably would be that way. They probably would think along those lines. Will you put a dress? They're not familiar with our Thanksgiving customs. So it would probably be much, much different for them. So understand that communication is usually tied to some kind of social aspect, social sharing of information. Could be environmental, could be conceptual, so forth and so on. But there's a sharing there in social norms, social structures. But also think about there are other ways to communicate too. Obviously, poetry, music. We think about music or poetry versus prose, so forth and so on. There are many, many different ways. Now, Revelation is a style of writing. It is a book in the New Testament that is written with apocalyptic style of writing. So it is an apocalyptic writing. In fact, Revelation 1:1 tells us at the very beginning, this is a apocalypsis of Jesus Christos, or Jesus Christ. So it tells us right there what it is, the style of writing that it is. Now your translation is going to say Revelation. The word apocalypsis means hidden from, is what it's being said. And I'm going to come back to that when we talk about interpreters. But understand this is information that's hidden. And so it tells us right there what kind of writing it is. Now let me give you a date real quick of Revelation. And then we can kind of move from there. The prevalent date for the writing of Revelation is 95 CE. It would fit toward the end of Domitian, his reign. And a lot of people are comfortable with that date. We do know for sure that this area, where these 7 churches, I'm going to talk about these churches next week, these 7 churches that are described and that are presented in chapters 2 and 3, they all reside within Asia Minor. And we know specifically from historical data, not biblical information, this would be from Roman governmental data that they still had, that there was turmoil in Asia Minor for Christians at the turn of the 1st century. We have governors writing back to try to figure out what to do with these Christians. They're writing to the Caesar at the time, who's Trajan. So towards the beginning of the 1st century. So it's not, and we know that under the reign of Nero, which is around, he died in 60, I think 68 is a good time to put him his death, 68, 67, 68, that there was already a negative slant towards Christianity in Rome itself. And Asia Minor is a place where they are enthralled with the Roman culture. They wanted to be known as Roman loyalists, let's put it that way. So they follow that lead very carefully. So we know that in Asia Minor, in the beginning of the 2nd century, that there is persecution going on for Christians. And in that writing, they even talk about Christians who experienced this difficulty prior years. So it's not hard to put this stuff going on in Revelation within the latter part of the 1st century. Revelation itself talks about being a tribulation. I'll talk about that more coming up, that the people are in the tribulation at that time. So 95 seems to fit real well for me. Now, there is a movement now to move the date earlier to 70, before 70. And the reason why is that there is a lot of imagery connected to the temple in Jerusalem in Revelation. Now, about Jerusalem and the temple, they are destroyed by the Romans in 70. Both of those, the city and the temple, are destroyed by Romans in 70. Completely, it's done. Those places are gone. So most people would 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 think that well, if you're going to use that imagery, that must mean that these places are still standing. There must still be a city there. There must still be a temple there. So they're moving the dating back before 70. And the reason why they would say that would be that why would the author use that imagery when these places are destroyed? It doesn't seem to be a very comforting image to use. And so why would a person use that type of imagery in 95? Interesting question. Very, very interesting. Regardless, it doesn't matter which date you choose or prefer. You can read about it from other places. There are places you can find out information about this. But it's not going to change the messaging of Revelation. Revelation's messages can be boiled down to a couple simple ideas. The first is this: God is faithful. God is faithful. And second's this: God's people must remain faithful to Him. If you follow those two principles, you're not going to have any problem with what's being established, said, whatever's going on in Revelation itself. I mean, it's pretty clear that God's people will be taken care of. Now, I'll get in that a little bit more. Now, about Revelation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Revelation today for another probably 15 minutes. Next week I'm going to talk about Revelation again, and the next week I'm going to talk about Revelation again. So I would urge you to read that chapter about Revelation. I'll continue talking about Revelation. It is a very complex subject. There's no doubt about it. Some of the information that I'll be presenting to you will be new to you. It is not new information in the Christian educational world. The information I'm presenting to you is old as the hills. It's a shame that Academy never really reached down into the church to help her out. I know there were some problems in the early 20th century, but the church foolishly abandoned the Academy, which was not a good idea. And because of that, the church suffered. A lot of lacking of information. So, we're going to talk a lot about what's going on in Revelation. Now, it is a very unique writing. It's unique in the entire Bible. There is no other writing in the Bible that is fully blown apocalyptic style of writing. Parts of Daniel are apocalyptic, for sure. Chapters 10, 11, 12. They're definitely apocalyptic. There's no doubt about it. Parts of Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14. Very strange, apocalyptic style writing. Beyond that, I am hesitant. I could say maybe Matthew in the New Testament, Matthew 24, has apocalyptic elements. Mark 13, Luke 21, these have apocalyptic elements within them for sure. But they're not fully implemented apocalyptic style writings. Revelation is. I'm hesitant to apply any kind of apocalyptic labeling to Isaiah. Apocalyptic style of writing definitely has a window in history. You can think 200 years before Jesus, 200 years after Jesus, so 200 years BCE, 200 years CE. This is the time frame, 400 years when this style of writing is being produced. It is being produced by Jewish people only. So if we begin to label some of these Old Testament writings as apocalyptic, then we need to move them towards the 200 date, and I'm hesitant to do that with Isaiah. In fact, I won't do it with Isaiah. I don't even use that kind of labeling with Isaiah. Maybe I might say proto-apocalyptic with hesitation, but I'm cautious that way. Anyway, this is a unique style of writing, Revelation. It is, the apocalyptic writing is completely Jewish. It only emerges from a Jewish culture. It has a historical window, 200 years before Jesus, 200 years after Jesus, when this is a style of writing that is quite popular. There are many other apocalyptic writings that we know of. There's the apocalypse of Peter, there's the apocalypse of Paul, there's the apocalypse of Moses. I think there's apocalypse of Abraham. There are many types of apocalyptic type of writings. There are some that aren't even called apocalyptic. I think there's a Baruch and some others. There are many types of apocalyptic writings out there. Just because we only have a limited supply in the Bible doesn't mean that we have we don't have other places to look at this stuff. It's there for sure. It's a very popular style of writing for some reason at that time. Now, here's something about Revelation before I start talking about apocalyptic writing. Something that's quite odd, to tell you the truth, is that the writer of Revelation, I mean, from the manuscripts we don't have original writings. So we can't go back to an original and say, here's the original. We don't have those. I mean, time is, you just can't keep things after so much time. And time just basically destroys things after a while. But anyway, the manuscripts. So we can say in the manuscripts that from the writing, it seems like the person that wrote was not very fluent in Greek. Definitely was a second language, and he was very poor at it. There are many instances where there are grammatical mistakes, where the person writing used the wrong kind of case within a position within a sentence. So let me give you an example. In English, if you heard someone say, him is teaching the Bible, you would know that's inappropriate. You don't use him that way. It cannot be used as a subject. It's a pronoun that's sets in a position of an object. So you don't use that. That's inappropriate. You would say he is teaching or he teaches the Bible. We have similar kind of ideas going on with the Greek, and there's just many instances. In fact, there's a term for that are used by Revelation scholars, solecisms, which is a regular word. That's a vocabulary word. It means basically that some kind of mistake in grammar in a speech or a phrase or something to that effect. But anyway, people are aware of them. There are very many. So about Revelation. So it is an apocalyptic writing. As I said in chapter 1, verse 1, it says that it is the revelation of Jesus Christ, or the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. So right there we are told what style of writing it is. So it's unique that way. Now, apocalyptic writing is highly fantastic, highly symbolic. It is not representative of real events, though. This is not the way things are going to transpire. Now, conceptually, yes, but not according to each detail presented. This would be a good instance when the proverb, don't lose sight of the forest for the sake of the tree, would fit. Many times in Revelation, you have got to step back and think in a big picture. So the writer's trying to paint pictures for us. Now, I'm going to come back to that. Now, so apocalyptic writing generally is a fictitious narrative. Yes, there is a storyline, even in this strange, bizarre type of writing. So it's fictitious. It is representing real concepts, but in a fictitious way and in a narrative type of setting. Now, apocalyptic writing communicates through symbols. In fact, in verse 1 of Revelation, our English translations do not do a very good job with it, but the writer tells us that the information will be shown through signs. There's a verb there that is the verbal form for making a sign, displaying a sign, expressing a sign, so whatever. It's the word that comes out of Gospel of John that's used. Gospel of John never calls any of Jesus' ministry acts a miracle. He always calls them a sign. This is what is being presented here. And so there is a sign. There's going to be signs presented to us there. So this is going to communicate to us through symbols. Now, these symbols had to have been understood by the author and the audience. They would have shared this information. There is no reason for the author to communicate this way. Again, no one wants to be misunderstood. That's a waste of time. Who is going to sit down and spend hours writing and be like, my goal is not to be understood? That just makes no sense at all. And so people don't do that. There's nobody that nefarious or devious. You can get James Bond movies out of your mind. That's just not going to happen. People want to be understood. So we can safely assume that the author expected his audience to understand what he was saying in this fantastic way. They would have been accustomed to this type of writing. Again, it was popular in Jewish circles and became popular in early Christian circles, but only up to about 200. Then after that, it's kind of given away. Now, Revelation was not easily accepted by early Christians. I didn't tell you this. And so it's a weird message. In fact, I'll talk about this more next week. But there seems to be a different messaging going on in Revelation that is presented in other areas of the New Testament. So, for instance, the idea of a mission, sharing the gospel message with people, it's not there in Revelation. Christianity at this point in Revelation is on the defense. We are trying to withstand the onslaught of wickedness, and we are asking God to prevail, who does. That is the concept that is presented here. It will project a very negative view through these symbols, for sure, but it is connected with symbols itself. And so, now these symbols, the better you understand the Old Testament, or the better you understand information from the Old Testament, not only events, like for instance, Exodus is a big theme within Revelation. The ministry of Ezekiel is a pretty major theme. Off the top of my head, I'm sure more will come later, and I don't want to get bogged down, but the better you understand the Old Testament, the better you're going to be able to understand some of this symbiology that is presented in Revelation. But there is a purpose for this communication. Again, Revelation is really meant to be encouraging to Christians. But this communication style is odd. Now, Revelation tries to communicate. Let me use a modern example, or one that I know as a kid. I used to read comic books a lot. You guys are probably familiar with comic books. There's not a lot of speech in a comic book. Not a lot of dialogue or monologue. Mostly action. Very little words. But there are words, but just very, very little. Mostly the pictures carry the message all the way through. That's kind of what Revelation is doing. It uses words, though, to paint a picture. It doesn't illustrate for us like a comic book does, but it uses the words to project an image upon our minds, is what it's doing. And so we've got to think that way. So again, we really need to think conceptually and not get bogged down in the details. Don't lose sight of the forest for the sake of a tree. Now, about this style of writing. So it is unique to Jewish people. Again, I said that Christian people will utilize it to some degree. As I said before, Revelation was not accepted by early Christians just because it presented such an odd picture of God Himself. And there are some differing messages, and I'm going to come back to that next week. But for one thing about mission, later on in Revelation, God's people are actually called to withdraw themselves from society, to withdraw themselves from wickedness. There are differing pictures there. We have a picture of Christ as a warrior, which some people seem to be troubled by. But that image is presented in the Old Testament. God is presented as a warrior in the Old Testament. Regardless, there were some Christians, and you think about the way the empire was split, you basically talk about a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire, and there were different cultures and differences between these two realms. The Western part of the Roman Empire did not like the book of Revelation. The Eastern part of the Greco-Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire, did not like the book of James. James was one of those compromise books, and I think St. Peter might have been involved also, but they had to come to some kind of compromise about Revelation itself. So it's troubled Christians for quite a while. But it is a unique writing for Jewish people. These are the only people that are writing this way. Only the Jewish people, only their culture, and it's from their history. So they have their history is pretty dismal. At this point in history, they basically have been a conquered people for over 800 years. They have not been a free people. Now, they had times, thinking of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is basically 100 years before the birth of Jesus, 150 years before the birth of Jesus. Doesn't last but about, maybe a little over 100 years, or maybe 100 years. It doesn't last that long. the Jewish people actually have freedom, but they're always worried that the Greeks, their Greek neighbors, would overrun them. And so there was constant fear all the time of being overrun by the Greeks who had subjugated them before. So, and then the Romans came in. So they never really had they never were a free people. So this type of writing definitely has a very dismal projection of the world or a world view. And it's coming from a conquered style of people. Now, apocalyptic writing will also present a dualistic perspective. Now, what I mean by that is that you will have a defined struggle between good and evil. So we will have this tension all the way through. Now, evil is formidable, but it is never as powerful as goodness. Goodness will always prevail. Always. And God is the source of goodness. So even though you can say elements of evil, Satan seems to be, there's an image of Satan presented clearly in Revelation 12 and onward, that these elements, these entities, whatever language you want to use, they are powerful, but they do not share the same type of power as God does. In fact, the narrator of Revelation is very, very clear that God only allows things to happen. If God were not to allow it, it would not happen. God allows things to transpire. So we have this struggle between good and evil, but good will always prevail. Now, in this style of writing, God's people are in turmoil. So the wicked society is pressuring. In this instance, there seems to be persecution present. In fact, I'll talk about the tribulation coming up next week. But there is persecution present. There's an expectation of more persecution in the future, and so forth. So there is a very negative worldview, let's put it that way. So God's people are in despair, and they have nowhere to turn because they cannot defeat this or withstand it under their own power. They don't have the means, they don't have the power, they don't have whatever it is, influence. They cannot withstand it. They need help from God. Naturally, they cry out to God. So that's what happens. So it's a very, very negative picture. They cry out to God. Now, in apocalyptic writing, as I said before, there usually, in fact, it should be, in most instances, there should be an interpreter. So this information is hidden information. There's no way that John would know unless someone was able to reveal this information to him. That's the idea. So in apocalyptic writing, we have a person who reveals the information. Initially in Revelation, we have Jesus presenting information. Later on, we're going to have angels. But there has to be some kind of a being, a go-between God and humanity that explains this information, because it is very, very bizarre. Daniel, we have this going on in Daniel, pretty sure chapters 10 and chapter 11, for sure, and into chapter 12, I believe. But anyway, you have some kind of an interpreter being presenting information. The person themselves, again, would not be able to discern the information unless someone revealed the information to them. So there's an interpreter. Now, after God's people cry out for justice, God responds. Now, he responds in a very, very positive way. Now, all this happens very, very quickly in the drama of Revelation itself. But God's people, when God's people cry out for justice from God, God delivers justice, and God's people are protected. So God's people are not going to endure any of the difficulties that most people think that's going to happen to people in the end of time. That's not true. God's people are protected. They're not even, we just are awaiting the final judgment. That's basically all there is. But God's justice will prevail, and there's a picture of it prevailing within Revelation itself. And God's people are not afflicted by the acts of justice that God sends out. God's people are protected. In fact, there's parts where he says, don't touch those who have basically, he says language of has my name upon their forehead, something like that, or his people. But basically, when it comes down to Christians, it's those who have the Holy Spirit. So God knows who his are because he resides within them. So he's able to protect those people. Now, God's justice prevails ultimately. It does. God's people are blessed with ongoing life with him. In fact, there'll be community again that's reestablished. That is very, very similar to Genesis 2 and 3. In fact, we have images presented again. The tree of life is presented again. We have these rivers ideas presented again. And so we have a lot of similarities where we have this closeness that was shared in Genesis 2 and 3, a closeness between God and humanity is realized again at the end of Revelation. Now, there's a lot of things that happen before these things transpire, but for them to transpire, obviously, wickedness or non-Christians receive condemnation. That's what Revelation teaches. There is condemnation. And there are also what I would consider concepts that are condemned also, like death. So death is actually thrown into the lake of burning sulfur. Hades, a term associated with Greek mythology, probably just means the realm of the dead, is thrown into the lake of burning sulfur. Then ultimately we have Satan also being thrown in there, and some of his satanic cohorts, whatever, is thrown into this lake of burning sulfur. They receive condemnation. But God's people continue on with him. Now, in Revelation itself, I'm getting ready to close. I'll talk about this more. There are basically 5 cycles from Revelation 4 through 22. 5 cycles. They say the same thing, except in a different way. And they'll provide a more detailed image, still thinking picture, signs, more detailed image of an element within the this cycling pattern. So I'll talk about this more coming up. Basically, you have 5 repetitions of Revelation. So it really does us no good to preach all the way, verse by verse, chapter by chapter through Revelation. You don't need to do that. In fact, it would be better for you to pick the elements that produce the clearest picture about one part of the process and talk about that from that perspective. In fact, that's how I'll approach through Revelation. So we will not be going after chapter 4. We're not going to go through it verse by verse, chapter by chapter. We will be doing it in a very particular manner. Let's put it that way. That'll be starting a week after next. But remember this. Revelation communicates in a very odd way. It communicates in an apocalyptic style of writing. An apocalyptic style of writing is going to be highly symbolic. So we may have to, or you may have to try to catch up on the information regarding what the symbol is projecting, what it's communicating. But it's going to communicate that way. We do have God's justice being presented. The book itself is a book of encouragement. And the message can be boiled down to this. God is faithful, and God's people must be faithful to him. Now, Revelation communicates logically. We have to understand the symbols. We have to be able to infer them. It communicates emotionally, means it stirs us, maybe our anger, maybe our rousing of feelings of love, or maybe joy, so forth and so on. But it also communicates ethically. It does call for God's people to separate themselves from a wicked society. Get out of her, my people. Chapter 18 says it twice. Get out of her, my people. And so there is to be, there's an ethical challenge presented also to Christians within Revelation itself. So, but overall, Revelation is going to communicate to us conceptually, for sure. So again, next week I'll talk about Revelation again, and the week after that I'll be talking about Revelation again. So I look forward to our next 2 weeks, and I'll see you all on Sunday. Take care.